Lindsey Parker stood by her kitchen window, her gaze fixed on the perfectly maintained lawn of the house that her husband, Jake, had built for them after 5 years of marriage. This house, while beautiful, felt like her only real achievement, and more like a prison with each passing day. She heard the familiar rumble of Jake's truck pulling into the driveway, right on schedule as always. Dependable, steady, and completely predictable. Lindsey forced a smile as Jake walked in, leaving faint, dusty boot prints across the hardwood floor. "Hey, Hon," he called out, hanging his jacket by the door. "Something smells good in here." Lindsey turned away from the window, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Just a casserole. Nothing special." Jake crossed the room and planted a quick kiss on her cheek. "You know I always love your cooking. How was your day?" "Oh, the usual grind," Lindsey replied with a flat tone. "Another day at the office." Jake nodded as he reached for a beer from the fridge. "Well, I've got some good news. I landed that big contract I've been telling you about. Looks like we might finally get to take that vacation you've been asking for." Lindsey's smile wavered at the thought. A vacation, just her and Jake, alone. The very idea turned her stomach. "That's great, babe," she said, forcing herself to sound excited. "I'm really proud of you." As they sat down to eat, Lindsey found herself studying Jake's face. He was still ruggedly handsome, with that strong jaw and warm eyes, the very traits she had fallen in love with years ago. But now, as she looked at him, an unsettling sense of restlessness gnawed at her. Jake launched into a detailed account of his day, describing the progress on his latest project. Lindsey nodded along, pretending to be interested, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about Evan, her coworker, and the way he had looked at her during their last meeting. She couldn't shake the memory of that electric moment when their hands brushed over a report. "Lindsey, are you all right?" Jake's voice snapped her back to the present. She blinked, realizing she had been aimlessly pushing her food around on her plate. "Sorry, just a bit tired. It's been a long day." Jake reached across the table, his hand rough with calluses, and took hers. "I know I've been swamped with work. How about we spend some time together this weekend, just the two of us?" Lindsey nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. "Yeah, that sounds good." Later that night, as Jake slept peacefully beside her, Lindsey lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the life they had built together, secure, comfortable, but utterly devoid of any passion. Her thoughts drifted to Evan and how her pulse quickened every time she was near him. With a quiet sigh, she slipped out of bed and padded into the bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back felt like a stranger. How had she become this person, a liar, a cheat? The next morning, Lindsey arrived at the office earlier than usual. She told herself it was to get ahead on her work, but deep down, she knew the real reason. Evan always came in early, too. As if on cue, she heard his voice coming from the break room. "Well, look who's here bright and early," Evan said, leaning casually against the doorframe, a coffee cup in hand. He was everything Jake wasn't, younger, sharper, with a dangerous edge that made Lindsey's heart race. "Just trying to stay on top of things," she replied, her voice steady even though her nerves were anything but. Evan smirked, stepping closer as he lowered his voice. "Oh, I'm sure you are. I couldn't stop thinking about you last night." Lindsey's cheeks flushed. "Evan, we can't. Not here." He chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "Who said anything about here? I was thinking more like my place after work." Lindsey knew she should say no. She thought about Jake, likely already out on a job site, working hard to provide for them. But as she met Evan's gaze, all thoughts of her husband seemed to disappear. "All right," she whispered, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was nearby. "What time?" Evan's grin widened. "I'll text you the details." "Don't make me wait, Lindsey." As he walked away, Lindsey felt a knot of excitement and dread twist in her stomach. She was really about to go through with this. She was going to cheat on her husband. The day dragged on, each minute stretching out like an eternity. Lindsey kept glancing at her phone, anxiously awaiting Evan's message. When it finally arrived, her hands trembled as she read the address. At 5 o'clock, she packed up her things, heart pounding, and sent Jake a quick text, "Working late. Don't wait up." Another lie. Evan's place was in a sleek, modern high-rise downtown, steel and glass everywhere. As she knocked on the door, Lindsey had a brief moment of clarity. She could turn around, go home to Jake, and put an end to this madness. But then the door opened, and when she saw Evan, her hesitation evaporated. "I was starting to think you changed your mind," he said, pulling her inside. Before she could respond, his lips were on hers, urgent and demanding. She kissed him back just as intensely, months of repressed desire spilling out. As Evan led her to the bedroom, Lindsey caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wild, her clothes already in disarray. But for the first time in what felt like years, she felt truly alive. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and guilt, Evan's hands exploring her skin, his lips tracing every inch of her. The thrill of doing something forbidden collided with the crushing realization that she was betraying Jake. Afterward, as they lay entangled in the sheets, Lindsey felt the first pangs of regret. She thought about Jake, likely at home, wondering where she was. The guilt washed over her like a wave. "I should leave," she muttered, sitting up and reaching for her clothes. Evan propped himself up on one elbow, watching her closely. "You sure? The night's still young." Lindsey shook her head. "I can't. I don't even know what this was." Evan's laugh was sharp. "Come on, Lindsey. We both know exactly what this was. Don't try to act innocent now." His words stung, but she knew they were true. She had made her choice, and there was no undoing it. As she drove home, her mind raced. How could she look Jake in the eye? How could she live with the knowledge of what she had done? When she finally walked through the door, Jake was asleep on the couch, the TV still on. A wave of relief washed over her, quickly replaced by a flood of shame. He trusted her so completely that he hadn't even questioned her excuse for being late. Lindsey tiptoed upstairs and into the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the guilt along with Evan's lingering scent. As the water cascaded over her, Lindsey made a vow. This was a one-time mistake. It would never happen again. But even as she whispered the promise to herself, she knew it wasn't true. The thrill of being with Evan, the rush of their secret meetings, was too powerful to resist. She already wanted more. In the weeks that followed, her life spiraled into a tangled web of lies. Lindsey quickly became adept at crafting convincing stories to explain her absences, late nights at work, drinks with colleagues, imaginary client meetings. Jake bought every excuse, never doubting her, always trusting. And Evan, he couldn't get enough. They met as often as possible, whether at his place, cheap motels, or even after hours in Lindsey's office. Each encounter left her feeling more alive, but the weight of guilt grew heavier with each lie. One particularly risky afternoon, they found themselves tangled up in the office bathroom. Lindsey was perched on the sink, with Evan standing between her legs. The thrill of almost getting caught made everything even more exhilarating. But then, they heard footsteps, and Lindsey's heart stopped cold when she recognized the voice of Eli Thompson, the CEO of their firm. "Evan, you in there?" Thompson called out. Evan quickly covered Lindsey's mouth with his hand, his eyes wide with fear. They stood perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, as Thompson knocked on the door. What felt like an eternity passed before they finally heard him walk away, grumbling something about needing maintenance. Once the coast was clear, Lindsey let out a shaky laugh. "Oh my God, that was way too close." But Evan wasn't laughing. His expression changed, a calculating look crossing his face, something Lindsey hadn't seen before. "You know," he said slowly, pulling out his phone, that was a little too close for comfort. "We might need some insurance." Lindsay's laughter died on her lips. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her stomach tightening with unease. Evan's smile was cold as he held up his phone. "I've been recording us. Every single time." Lindsay felt the floor tilt beneath her. "What? Why would you do that?" "Relax, babe," Evan replied, his tone unnervingly casual considering what he'd just revealed. "It's just for fun. Unless you want it to get serious." Lindsay felt a wave of nausea. "Serious? What do you mean?" The look in Evan's eyes sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't the same playful man she thought she knew. He had turned into someone completely different. "You're going to let some of my friends have a little fun with you," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure these videos get sent to Jake and your boss. What do you think Eli Thompson will do when he sees this, here, in the office bathroom?" Lindsay's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. "Evan, please. You can't be serious." But the coldness in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was dead serious. "Do what I say, or your perfect little life crumbles. Your husband finds out everything, and your cushy job disappears." Lindsay begged, trying to plead with him, but Evan wasn't hearing it. He gave her a deadline and left, leaving her alone in the bathroom, her world unraveling. That evening, Lindsay sat at the dining table, absently pushing food around her plate. Jake happily chatted about his day, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside his wife. "Are you feeling all right?" Jake's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've hardly touched your dinner." Lindsay looked up, meeting his worried gaze. For a brief moment, she considered spilling everything, confessing the truth, but the thought of losing him, of watching his trust in her shatter, was unbearable. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just a bit of a headache, that's all." Jake reached across the table, his hand warm and familiar, but to Lindsay, it suddenly felt like his touch was searing her. "Why don't you go lie down?" he offered. "I'll take care of the dishes tonight." Lindsay nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape. As she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, the weight of her choices pressed down on her like a boulder. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. But how? Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Lindsay's mind raced with possibilities. She could go to the police, but then the whole ugly truth would come out. She could try to reason with Evan, but the hardness in his eyes made it clear that wasn't an option. As the night dragged on, one horrifying realization sank in: there was only one way out. She had to tell Jake the truth. The thought filled her with dread, but what other choice did she have? It was better he hear it from her than discover it through some disgusting video. With a shaky breath, Lindsay made up her mind. Tomorrow, she would tell Jake everything. She could only hope that, somehow, someway, he would find it in his heart to forgive her. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that her entire world was on the verge of crumbling. Lindsay's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of wine, the deep red liquid swirling in the glass, mirroring the chaos churning in her stomach. She heard the familiar rumble of Jake's truck pulling into the driveway, a sound that now filled her with dread. The front door creaked open, and Jake's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "Lindsay? You home?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. In the kitchen, she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake appeared in the doorway, smiling at first, but his expression quickly shifted when he saw the look on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern furrowing his brow. Lindsay gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Jake. We need to talk." Frowning, Jake took a seat. "You're scaring me, Lindsay. What's going on?" Lindsey took a long sip of wine, stalling for just a few more seconds of normalcy before everything fell apart. "I've done something awful," she began, her voice shaking. Jake leaned forward, his face full of worry. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it. Just tell me." Lindsey shook her head, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I don't think this can be fixed, Jake. I've been having an affair." The words hung in the air between them, suffocating and heavy. Jake sat there, unmoving, his face unreadable. "An affair?" he repeated, his voice low, dangerously controlled. "With who?" Lindsey swallowed hard. "Evan, from work. It's been going on for a few months." Jake's fists tightened on the table. "A few months? You've been lying to me for months." Lindsey nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "There's more," she whispered. "He's been recording us. He's threatening to send the videos to you and my boss if I don't do what he says." Jake shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He began pacing the kitchen, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Jesus, Lindsey. What the hell were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," she said softly, tears spilling over. "I was bored, I was selfish. I'm so sorry, Jake." He turned to her, his eyes blazing with rage. "Sorry? You think sorry's enough to fix this?" He slammed his fist onto the counter, making Lindsey flinch. "Do you think I'm some kind of fool who's just going to cry over you and some guy from the office?" Lindsey shrank back in her chair. "No, I didn't mean." "Shut up," Jake growled, breathing heavily, his stare burning into her. After a long, tense pause, he spoke again, his voice eerily calm. "Give me his name." "His full name." Lindsey blinked, confused. "What? Why?" "His name, Lindsey. Now." "Evan Thompson," she whispered, barely audible. Jake gave a single nod, then turned and stormed out of the kitchen. Lindsey heard him grab his keys. "Jake, wait," she called, chasing after him. "Where are you going?" Jake paused at the front door, his hand gripping the doorknob. He turned to face her, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "I'm going to take care of this. Stay here." Before Lindsey could say another word, he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. She collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing. What had she done? What was Jake going to do? The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like a lifetime. Lindsey paced the living room, alternating between frantically calling Jake, only to be sent straight to voicemail, and imagining every worst-case scenario. It was well past midnight when she finally heard the familiar rumble of his truck. She rushed to the door, flinging it open. "Jake, where have you been? What did you do?" He brushed past her, his knuckles bruised, and a small cut visible just above his eyebrow. "It's done," he said flatly. Lindsey's eyes widened in alarm. "What do you mean, done?" "Jake, what did you do to Evan?" Jake turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I did what needed to be done. That scumbag won't be bothering you again." "Oh my God," Lindsey whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Is he?" "He's still breathing," Jake replied, his voice filled with disgust. "Barely. I made sure he understands exactly what'll happen if he ever comes near you again. And I smashed his phone. Those videos? They're gone." Relief washed over Lindsey, but it was quickly drowned by a deep wave of shame. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Can we try to fix this?" Jake let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Fix this? You really think I want to stay married to you after all this?" He reached into his jacket, pulling out a stack of papers and tossing them onto the coffee table. Lindsey's heart sank as she recognized what they were. "Divorce papers," she murmured, her voice trembling. Jake nodded. Had them drawn up a while ago. Call it a gut feeling. Lindsay's world crumbled around her. Please, Jake. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job. We can go to counseling. Please, don't throw away our marriage. Jake's eyes were like ice as he stared at her. Do you even love me? He asked, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. Lindsay nodded frantically, her desperation clear. Yes, of course I do. Then prove it, he said, motioning toward the papers. Sign them. Lindsay's legs buckled, and she collapsed to her knees. Jake, please. I'm begging you. Just give me another chance. Jake looked down at her, unmoved by her tears. You had your chance, Lindsay. You blew it the moment you opened your legs for that loser. His words sliced through her like a knife. Lindsay had never seen this side of Jake before, cold, ruthless, unforgiving. Why? She choked out, barely able to find her voice. Why confront Evan if you were just going to leave me anyway? Jake's lip curled in disgust. Because no one threatens my wife. Even if she is a cheating whore. Lindsay flinched at the harshness of his words. I'm not. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm not. Sign the papers, Lindsay, Jake cut her off, his voice leaving no room for argument. We're finished. With trembling hands, Lindsay reached for the papers. As she scribbled her name on each line, it felt like she was signing away not just her marriage, but her entire life. When she was done, Jake snatched them from her, barely glancing at the signatures before shoving the papers back into his jacket. Pack your things, he ordered, already turning to leave. I want you out of my house by morning. Lindsay watched him walk away, feeling utterly hollow. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice small, broken. Jake paused at the base of the stairs, not bothering to look back. That's not my problem anymore. You made this mess, Lindsay. Now deal with it. As Jake disappeared up the stairs, Lindsay sat there on the floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her life. How had it come to this? How had she destroyed everything she had for something so meaningless? Her thoughts drifted to Evan, wondering what exactly Jake had done to him. Part of her wanted to reach out, to check if he was all right, but deep down she knew that would only make things worse. With a heavy heart, Lindsay began packing her belongings. As she moved through the house, gathering clothes and personal items, every corner seemed to hold a memory. The framed photo from their wedding day. The silly souvenir from their honeymoon. The handmade blanket Jake's mom had given them last Christmas. Every object was a painful reminder of the life she had ruined, the trust she had shattered. As the first light of dawn broke, Lindsay stood by the front door, her suitcases at her feet. She glanced around the house one last time, her eyes landing on Jake, who stood at the top of the stairs. I really did love you, she said softly. Jake's expression remained cold and unmoved. Not enough, it seems. Lindsay nodded, accepting his harsh truth. She picked up her bags and walked out, gently closing the door behind her. As she loaded her things into the car, a sinking realization hit her, she had nowhere to go. She couldn't face her family, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes. All of her friends were mutual friends with Jake. She had lost them too. For a fleeting moment, she thought about going to Evan, but the very idea turned her stomach. He was the reason she had lost everything. Besides, after what Jake had done, Evan probably wouldn't want anything to do with her now. With no better options, Lindsay checked into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Sitting on the lumpy bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the full weight of her actions finally came crashing down. She had lost everything, her husband, her home, her career. There was no way she could go back to that life. Her friends were gone, and for what? A few reckless moments with a man who turned out to be manipulative and cruel. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. Her heart leapt, hoping it might be Jake, but when she glanced at the screen, her blood ran cold. A text message from an unfamiliar number flashed on her screen. "You ruined my life, so now I'm going to ruin yours." Lindsey's hands trembled as she read the words. It had to be from Evan. But how? Didn't Jake destroy his phone? Before she could even process it, another message popped up, this time with a video attached. With shaking hands, Lindsey pressed play, her stomach churning as the grainy footage of her and Evan in the office bathroom played out on the screen, their inappropriate encounter laid bare. A third message followed, "I sent this to everyone at the office, including Thompson. Hope it was worth it, you idiot." Lindsey dropped the phone like it had burned her. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But deep down, she knew this was real. These were the consequences of her choices. She thought of Jake, how he had tried to protect her even after everything. And how had she repaid him? By dragging both of their reputations through the mud. As Lindsey curled up on the bed, sobbing uncontrollably, she realized this was just the beginning. Her life, as she had known it, was over. And it was all her fault. Lindsey stared at the phone, the screen still displaying Evan's vicious message. Her hands shook as she dialed Jake's number, praying he would answer. After several rings, it went to voicemail. "Jake, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know you hate me, but Evan sent the video to everyone at work. I don't know what to do. Please, please call me back." She hung up and collapsed onto the dingy motel bed. How had everything fallen apart so fast? A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Her heart pounded as she cautiously approached it. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Open the damn door, Lindsey," came Jake's voice from the other side. Her hands fumbled with the lock, and she opened the door to find him standing there, his face filled with barely contained anger. "Jake," she began, but he brushed past her, storming into the room. "Save it. I'm not here for your apologies." Lindsey shut the door and turned to face him. "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. Jake's eyes swept over the shabby room before landing on her. As the morning sun began to rise, Lindsey stood in the entryway, her suitcases at her feet. She looked around the house one final time, her eyes eventually landing on Jake, who stood at the top of the stairs. "I really did love you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's expression didn't change. Not enough, apparently. Lindsey nodded, accepting the truth in his words. She picked up her bags and stepped outside, gently closing the door behind her. As she loaded her belongings into the car, a harsh reality sank in, she had nowhere to go. She couldn't face her family, not after this, not after the disappointment she knew she'd see in their eyes. Her friends. They were all friends with Jake, too. She'd lost them as well. For a fleeting second, she thought about going to Evan, but the very idea made her feel ill. He was the reason everything had fallen apart, and after what Jake had done, she doubted Evan would even want to see her. With no other option, Lindsey checked into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. Sitting on the lumpy bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the full weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating. She had lost it all, her husband, her home, her career. There was no going back to her old life. Her friends were gone, and for what? A few stolen moments with a man who turned out to be manipulative and dangerous. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. Her heart leaped, hoping it might be Jake. But when she looked at the screen, her blood ran cold. A text from an unfamiliar number flashed on her screen. "You ruined my life, now I'll ruin yours." Lindsey's hands trembled as she stared at the words. It had to be Evan. But how? Didn't Jake destroy his phone? Before she could wrap her mind around it, another message came in, this time with a video attached. Her hands shook as she tapped play, her stomach sinking as the grainy footage of her and Evan in the office bathroom played out in all its ugly reality. A third message followed: I sent this to everyone at the office, including Thompson. Hope it was worth it, you idiot. Lindsey dropped the phone as though it had burned her. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But she knew it was all too real. These were the consequences of her actions. Her mind drifted to Jake, thinking of how he had tried to protect her, even after everything. And she had repaid him by destroying both their lives. As Lindsey curled up on the bed, sobbing uncontrollably, she realized this was just the beginning. Her life as she knew it was over. And it was all her fault. Staring blankly at the phone, Lindsey saw Evan's menacing text still on the screen. Her hands trembled as she dialed Jake's number, praying he'd answer. After several rings, it went to voicemail. Jake, please, she begged, her voice breaking. I know you hate me, but Evan sent the video to everyone at work. I don't know what to do. Please, please call me back. She hung up and collapsed onto the dingy motel bed. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door, making her jump. Her heart raced as she cautiously approached the door. Who is it? She called out. Open the damn door, Lindsey, came Jake's voice from the other side. Fumbling with the lock, Lindsey opened the door to find him standing there, barely contained fury etched on his face. Jake, she started, but he brushed past her, storming into the room. Don't. I'm not here for apologies. Lindsey closed the door and turned to face him. Then why are you here? She asked, her voice small. Jake's eyes scanned the shabby room before locking onto her. You're going to listen to me, Lindsey said, her voice shaking with anger. You're going to tell everyone that video was fake. Say you edited it or used some deepfake tech, I don't care how you explain it, but you're going to fix this. Evan rubbed his cheek, glaring at her. And why the hell would I do that? Lindsey's smile was cold, devoid of humor. Because if you don't, I'm going to the police. I'll tell them how you blackmailed me, how you threatened me. Trust me, they'll believe the heartbroken wife over some sleazy office jerk like you. Evan's confidence wavered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. You wouldn't. Try me, Lindsey shot back. You've already ruined my life, Evan. I've got nothing left to lose. Can you say the same? They locked eyes for a tense moment, neither one backing down. Finally, Evan looked away, his bravado crumbling. Fine, he muttered. I'll send an email saying it was all fake. But after that, I never want to see or hear from you again. Got it? Lindsey nodded as she stood. Believe me, the feeling's mutual. As she walked out of the coffee shop, a small sense of victory washed over her. It didn't fix everything, her marriage was still gone, her career still in shambles, but at least she had regained a bit of control over her life. In the weeks that followed, Lindsey worked to piece her life back together. She moved in with her sister temporarily, started looking for jobs in a new industry, and slowly began to accept that her marriage with Jake was truly over. One afternoon, as she scrolled through job postings, her phone rang. It was Jake. Hello, she answered, her heart pounding. Lindsey, Jake said bluntly, I've got the final divorce papers. I'll drop them off tomorrow for you to sign. Lindsey closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. Okay. Look, Jake continued, I'm not calling for any long talks. I'll be there around noon. Just be ready. The call ended before Lindsey could respond. She stared at the phone, emotions swirling inside her. Part of her had held on to the hope that time might soften Jake, that maybe they could talk things through, maybe even reconcile. But the coldness in his voice made it clear, this was truly the end. The next day, Lindsey paced her sister's living room, nervously waiting for Jake to arrive. When the doorbell rang, she practically jumped. Opening the door, she found Jake standing there, a manila envelope in his hand. He looked good, better than she remembered. It seemed the last few weeks had been kinder to him than they had been to her. "Hey," she greeted him softly. Jake didn't acknowledge her greeting. He simply handed her the envelope. "Everything you need is in here. Sign where it's marked and send it back to my lawyer." Lindsey took the envelope, her fingers brushing against his, but Jake quickly pulled his hand back, as if her touch burned him. "Jake," Lindsey started, "I know you don't want to hear this, but I really am sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." For a brief second, Jake's eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of the man she had once loved, the kind, compassionate man she had married. But just as quickly, that look was gone, replaced by cold indifference. "You're right," he said, his voice hard. "I don't want to hear it. Your apologies don't change anything, Lindsey. You made your choices, and now we both have to live with the consequences." Lindsey nodded, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. "I understand. For what it's worth, I hope you find happiness, Jake. You deserve it." Jake's expression didn't change. "Goodbye, Lindsey." As he turned to leave, Lindsey called after him one last time. "Jake, did you ever really love me?" He stopped, his back to her, and for a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, tinged with sadness. "I did. More than you ever knew." With those final words, Jake turned and walked away, leaving Lindsey standing in the doorway, the full weight of her mistakes crashing down on her. Later that night, Lindsey sat at the kitchen table in her sister's house, staring down at the signed divorce papers. She thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment, the restlessness that had pushed her toward Evan, the excitement that had blinded her to the consequences, and the selfishness that had destroyed her marriage and her life. As she sealed the envelope, she realized that by sending it off, she was officially ending her marriage to Jake. As she prepared to mail the papers, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would learn from this, work on becoming a better person, and maybe, someday, she'd find a way to forgive herself for everything she'd done. But there was one thing she knew for certain: Jake would never forgive her. And she couldn't blame him for that. Miles away, in the home he and Lindsey once shared, Jake sat in his office with a glass of whiskey in hand. He stared at a framed photo from their wedding day, both of them beaming, full of hope and dreams for the future. With a swift motion, he knocked the frame face down on the desk. It was time to move on. Lindsey had made her choice, and now he had made his. He would rebuild his life, stronger and wiser than before. As he gazed out over the city skyline, a calm sense of peace washed over him. He had faced betrayal and come out the other side. He hadn't let it break him. Instead, he had taken control, protected himself, and emerged victorious. For Jake, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to create a life on his own terms, free from the shadow of Lindsey's betrayal. He raised his glass in a silent toast. To new beginnings, to strength, and to triumph.